It is certainly a pleasure for me to be here tonight. I've had the occasion to come to several presentations here at the Grapevine Historical Society, and they've all been excellent. Hopefully I won't disappoint you. I'm going to see a few minutes of a little bit of a clip to tell you a little bit about Buffalo Soldiers before I make my presentation.
When you're under fire and you're laying there and you know you don't want to get up, but you know you have to get up, because in order to accomplish the mission and in order to save the guy to your left or to your right, you got to do your job, and that means getting up. That's bravery. That's the courage I think those Buffalo Soldiers had.
Buffalo Soldiers!
The buildings here at Fort McCavitt are quiet, long deserted. But once, this was a bustling outpost, part of a huge military experiment, an experiment that was expected to fail. Instead, it produced some of the fiercest fighters in the history of the United States military. The time was the 1860s. The western frontier was steeped in turmoil. The settlers throughout this area were unprotected. Tormented by outlaws, thieves, and hostile Indians, the U.S. government formed 6 regiments of African-American troops, known as the Buffalo Soldiers.
It's troops in line for the buffalo, get 'em moving, get 'em moving. Then squadron mass when the bugle blows, moving into line. Gonna fight all day, gonna fight all night. We got our money on the buffalo, somebody bet on the fight. Fire!
For over 100 years, the legacy of the Buffalo Soldiers was lost in a baffling historical void. But today, these men are finally getting their due recognition. The true story of the Ninth and the Tenth Cavalry has been embraced by both scholars and an eager public.
The Indian feared them because of his bravery and how he fought. The reason they gave him, they called him the Buffalo Soldier, because of the texture of his hair and the dark, fierce eyes. The buffalo had the dark brown eyes and showed no fear. And the black man fought with such ferocity and showed no fear. That's why the Indian gave them this name, because he feared and respected the buffalo, and he learned to fear and respect the black soldier as well. 75% of the soldiers that settled this area were Buffalo Soldiers. The only white men that were with them were the commanding officers. 75%. Almost all of the forts were manned and built by Buffalo Soldiers. They see on TV, they see all the modern portrays of things, and they see white cavalrymen coming in and doing these things. But what they don't realize, the white cavalrymen did come, but after the Buffalo Soldier had paved the way for him, built the forts for him, built the houses, made the bridges, did the roads, did the work. And now it's so important so that their families will understand the hardships that these men went through and the pride that goes with it.
Whenever I make one of these presentations, people always ask, well, where did this name Buffalo Soldiers come from, and where did they get the soldiers? Well, there is really no precise documentation of how the name actually came about. There's a bunch of different theories, but there's no validation to those theories. As you heard in this little clip, sometimes people say it's because the Native Americans, it reminded them of the buffalo. Sometimes they say it's because of the hair, and it's between the horns of the buffalo, they call a secret mane. Sometimes they say it's because they wore buffalo robes. And if you wore a buffalo robe and you're riding and you're down, and a Native American has never seen a black man in a white man's uniform, at a distance, it might look like the buffalo have returned. So there's a lot of theories, but there's really no definitive proof. I can certainly tell you, you'll hear lots of people talking about Buffalo Soldiers, especially today, but there really, as I've said, is no definitive proof that either they never call. I can certainly tell you the soldiers at the time did not call themselves Buffalo Soldiers. They were called a lot of things, some of them not too polite. Generally, they were often called brunettes. But they called themselves just soldiers. Often they were referred to as black regulars. So how were they created? Well, after the Civil War, the United States Congress created these regiments. As you heard in the clip, and initially there were 2 cavalry regiments, the Ninth and the 10th, and 4 infantries, the 39th, 38th, 39th, 40th, and 41st Infantry. Those 4 infantry units were later consolidated into the 24th and 25th Infantry. And that was the beginning of why the Buffalo Soldiers were created. The other question I get asked is, well, where did these soldiers come from? Well, there's a long history of that, one that is often overlooked. You may have heard it said, and it is true, that every war that the United States fought, African Americans served in it. Actually, before there was a United States and we had the French and Indian War, there's evidence that African Americans served in the French and Indian War. There's evidence that African Americans served at Bunker Hill, at Lexington, and Concord. When in 1778, the state of Rhode Island couldn't produce the number of recruits that they wanted, they enrolled an entire black regiment in the Revolutionary War. And they actually had an all-black cavalry unit from the state of Rhode Island. That was during the Revolutionary War. When George Washington got to Yorktown, about 1/3 of his troops were African Americans. Then, when we get to the War of 1812, well, in 1812, you heard about Commodore Perry on the Great Lakes. 1/6 of all the sailors that fought on the Great Lakes were African Americans. You know, Andrew Jackson in the Battle of New Orleans, he relied very heavily on free black men who fought, and some former enslaved people who fought in the Battle of New Orleans. After the War of 1812, of course, there's a Civil War. Ask people often when I'm making these shows, how many people do you think black fought in the Civil War? They'll say 1,000, 2,000, several hundred. Well, actually, 180,000 served in the Union Army, and about 20,000 served in the Navy. So about 200,000 African Americans served in the Civil War, of which approximately 30,000 gave their lives in service to the Union. So when we get to 1866, many of the initial recruits were people who were former enlistees in the Union Army. The Union Army was called United States Colored Troops at the time. Served very well. So after the war, that's when the Buffalo Soldiers were created. Again, the name itself is one that some say also that the Native Americans gave us that name, but there's no evidence of that either. The Cheyennes were engaged fighting the Buffalo Soldiers initially, and they called them wild buffaloes, but there is no real evidence that is where the name comes from. There is documentation, a letter from one of the white officers' wives in 1872, and which she described the Buffalo Soldiers. That letter, however, wasn't really public until about the 1890s. In the letter, she made some very flattering things, said some flattering things about Buffalo Soldiers, which didn't go over too well, so it was never really released until the 1890s. The other place that you hear that term, many of you probably know the artist Frederick Remington. Well, Remington actually had jobs where he went to the West, writing for various magazines. And on one of his trips, he actually served and rode with Buffalo Soldiers in Arizona. He then spoke to his comrade, who was at this time was serving, and told him that he could make them famous. And I won't quote him, but I see Dr. McCaslin over here. He knows the quote as well as I do. But he said, "Oh, if you give me a crack at the colored cavalry, I will make you and them famous." And he did. Many people don't realize that he made lots of drawings of African-American soldiers in the 10th Cavalry and actually rode with them for a while. I have a few books in the back if you have time after a presentation. One of them is a book which has lots of Remington sketches in it. So that's basically how you get the idea of where this name came from and what they did. But if you really want to get an idea of how Buffalo Soldiers were, you have to understand what they went through and a little bit about their history. In order to do that, I'm going to have to bring to life someone who's long past. But before doing that, I need to tell you just a little bit more about their origins. As you heard in that piece, there were these units, but all the soldiers, enlisted men, were all black, and all the commanders were white, with only 3 exceptions. The 3 exceptions were 3 cadets who went to West Point. The first one was Lieutenant Flipper. He graduated from West Point in 1877. He had a very difficult time at West Point. There were approximately, during the Indian Wars period, about 12 people who were African American who were admitted to the West Point, but only 3 ever graduated. Flipper was the first. He was 4 years at West Point. In his 4 years at West Point, no one spoke to him, except in duty when they actually had to. Other than that, he was given the silent treatment. So he endured 4 years at West Point without anyone ever speaking to him unless they absolutely had to. But he graduated and served in the 10th. He was assigned to the 10th Cavalry. While in the 10th Cavalry, he served in patrols, but was in combat with the 10th Cavalry. Later on, he was ultimately court-martialed, allegedly for embezzling funds. At his court-martial, he was not convicted of embezzling any money, but he was found to be discharged for conduct unbecoming of an officer. The second person to graduate was John Alexander. He was in the class of 1887, and he was assigned to the Ninth Cavalry when he graduated. He had a very short time. He was only in the Ninth for about 5 years, 6 years. He served in the West, as most people in that period of time did. But he unfortunately died at a very young age. Died in his 30s, and so he didn't have much of a career. But the one soldier who did have the longest career was Charles Young. He graduated in the class of 1899. He was the third graduate. Things were a little better for him. People still didn't speak to him, but when he graduated, a lot of his fellow cadets said wonderful things about him. But he also did not have an easy time. Colonel Charles Young, which is what his last rank was, he, as I said, was assigned to the Ninth Cavalry. While in the Ninth Cavalry, he had several duties. When he served in the Ninth, he served both in this country, and when the Spanish-American War started, he was not allowed to lead troops. So they kept him stateside. Later on, he was sent to the Philippines. In the Philippines, this was guerrilla warfare, jungle warfare, and I will tell you more about that when you hear about Caleb Benson's story. But while in the Philippines, he led troops in combat. After being in the Philippines, his next major experience was in 1916, when Pancho Villa attacked the United States in Columbus, New Mexico. We had a punitive expedition, which was led by General Pershing. One of his majors at that time was Young. Young led one of the last cavalry charges and was one of the first people to use machine guns as covering fire, which Pershing took note of. Pershing thought very highly of Young, and he was promoted to colonel. And then at the outbreak of World War I, he was recommended to be a general. But times being what they were not going to have him leading white troops. So he was discharged and said he was not fit for duty. To prove that he was fit for duty, he was living in Ohio. He got on his horse and he rode his horse 500 miles to Washington, D.C. to prove that he was fit for duty. So he was promised by the then Secretary of War that, yes, he would get a star and he would be called back to duty. But that didn't happen during the First World War. After the First World War, he was then brought back into service and sent as a delegate to Africa. He later, while in Nigeria, contracted illness and he died in 1922. He has been awarded the General Star now posthumously, but those were the only three soldiers who, during the Indian Wars period, were officers in the Army. When Colonel Young was an officer, he was the only officer in the United States Army at the time. But as I said, to get a better picture of what these men went through, I have to tell you a story about Caleb Benson. But in order to do that, I'm going to have to go back in time and resurrect him. So I'll have to turn around. When I come back, I'll be somebody else. My name is Caleb Benson, and I was born in Aiken, South Carolina in 1861. My parents, who were formerly enslaved people, took us to Charleston, South Carolina when I was about 6 years old. By the time I was a young teenager, unfortunately, both my parents died. So as an orphan, I was trying to figure out what will I do in my life. I found my way to Columbia, South Carolina, and decided to enlist in the Ninth Cavalry. This is 1875. In 1875, I was only 5'4" and I weighed about 135 pounds. But I went to the recruiter and signed up. Now, when I say I signed up, I couldn't read or write. I just made my mark. The recruiter didn't seem to mind that I couldn't read or write. Looked at me and said, well, looks like you can tote a weapon. So I joined the Ninth Cavalry. Now, the Ninth Cavalry, they sent me to Fort Clark, Texas. Now, Texas, after the Civil War, was not a very welcoming place for somebody with a blue coat on. And if you had a blue coat and a black face, you were in double trouble. Well, to get an idea, they asked General Sheridan, who is now the general in that area of the country, they asked General Sheridan, same General Sheridan from the Civil War, about Texas. General Sheridan said, well, if I own 2 pieces of property, hell in Texas, I'd rent out Texas and live in hell. Right? That's what he thought of Texas. Because Texas at that time was a very difficult place, especially West Texas. There were lots of hostile Indians. There were Comancheros, a lot of outlaws. Well, this is where they sent me. When I got to Fort Clark in June, first thing they did is say, we're going out on patrol. Well, we were on patrol for 3 weeks. That's 375 miles on horseback. My bottom didn't like it too much, but that was my introduction to the Army. In those days, as you may have heard it and been aware of, we built forts, we strung telegraph wires, we tried to maintain order. So fighting Indians wasn't the only thing we did. In fact, it was the minor thing we did. We just spent more time in garrison duty and more time with civil disturbances. So when I was in Texas with the Ninth Cavalry for only about a year, because the Ninth Cavalry was then transferred to what was called the New Mexico Territory. In the New Mexico Territory, did very much the same types of things on forts. We weren't in New Mexico too long, again, a couple of years. I was then sent to Colorado. We helped to build Fort Lewis, which is near Pagosa Springs. And while in Fort Lewis, it's my first real battle with Indians. You see, the Utes were on a reservation there, and the Indian agent wanted them to become little white men and be farmers, and tried to make them plow under the lands where they kept their ponies. Well, they didn't like that too much, so there was a little bit of pushback. When they pushed back against that, he got nervous and was very afraid. So he called for the troops to come. So the army came down from Fort Steele, which is in Wyoming. They came down to the agency, which is called the Milk River Agency in Colorado. Before they could get to the agency, the Utes attacked them. When they were about 15 miles outside of the agency, the commanding officer was immediately shot. The other soldiers were pinned down. And when they got pinned down, the Utes shot the horses out from under them. So now they're at Milk River and they're surrounded by Utes. In the evening came, people got away and asked for help. The help was us. So we were, Captain Dodge, who was our commander, told us to saddle up. They gave us 250 rounds of ammunition and 3 days rations, and we made an overnight march to relieve them at Milk River. When they saw us coming, they all cheered that the Ninth Cavalry Black troops here to help us. But guess what? The same thing that happened to them happened to the Ninth. The Utes shot their horses and they were pinned down too. So this happened in September that year and lasted until early October when further reinforcements came. When the further reinforcements came, the Utes left and went back to the reservation. So that was my first encounter. Now, at that encounter, I'm like, my first 5-year enlistment was up. So I thought, maybe this Army thing isn't what I should do. So I left the Army for a few years, but there really wasn't much for me to do in civilian life. I could be a day laborer or I could work in the kitchen. I chose to work in the kitchen in a restaurant. I stayed there for a few years, learned how to cook, and became a baker. Then I said, the Army wasn't all that bad. Maybe it's good for me to go back. So in 1880, I rejoined the Army. This time, I enlisted in the 10th Cavalry. Now, the 10th Cavalry was getting ready and was sent to Arizona because Geronimo was on a warpath with his Chiricahuas. And so we were sent to Arizona. In addition to doing the usual things at post, we had, as I said before, we were always doing other duties. One of them was, again, building forts. I had an unfortunate accident. I was helping to build a well, and the ground caved in on me. Fortunately, the other troopers were able to rescue me, but not before I was injured. I went to the hospital and found out I had a double hernia. I couldn't really recuperate because Geronimo was on the warpath, so I immediately had to saddle up with the rest of the troops. And we were in the saddle at that time for about a month and a half. By the time I got back to Fort Apache, I was very ill because of the injury. Then I had to wear a truss for the rest of my service in the military. Now, I continued to be in Arizona, but by this time, the Apache Wars were just about over. The commanding officer of the 10th Cavalry requested, we would like to go somewhere where it's not hot and dry. We'd like to go north, maybe say to Kansas. Well, the Army sent us north, but it wasn't to Kansas. We went to the Dakota Territory in Montana. So here we are now, there. So while there at Fort Custer, a lot of changes were happening in the country. It's the 1890s. In 1893, there was a huge recession in the country. Lots of people were out of work. Then a fellow named Coxley decided that he wanted to have one of the first marches on Washington. So he was rallying people to come march to Washington to demand that the government make public service jobs, and that he was a Civil War veteran. He felt that, well, the men should be employed in public works projects. Lots of people thought that, and so there were some fellows out here in the West decided they would commandeer a train and ride the train to Washington. Well, that didn't go over too well, so they called out the soldiers, and that was us. So we stopped the train, arrested the fellows. They got sent to jail into that strike. And that was in July. A few months later, there was another labor unrest. This time it was in Billings, Montana, and they had taken over the railroad depot. Well, when we arrived, that strike was over very quickly. So we spent time there. At that point, a new war was starting. This time, it's the Spanish-American War, 1898. They put us on trains, sent us across the country to Chickamauga Park, Georgia, and later to Tampa, Florida, so we could board ships to go to Cuba. As you may recall, from Battleship Maine was exploded in Havana Harbor, and we declared war on Spain. The 24th and the 25th infantry units, as well as the Ninth and Tenth Cavalry, were part of the troops that were sent to Cuba. Everybody knows about Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. Some of the roughest riders were the Buffalo Soldiers. When Teddy Roosevelt went up San Juan Hill, the 10th Cavalry was on his right. The 9th Cavalry was on the left. He would not have made it up San Juan Hill without the Buffalo Soldiers. The first man in the blockhouse at the top of San Juan Hill was a Buffalo Soldier. Well, at this time, after the war was over, time for me to re-enlist again. I re-enlisted. This time they sent us to first to Alabama and then to Texas, still in the 10th Cavalry. But we noticed on our way to Texas a change was occurring in society. When we were left to go to fight the war in Cuba, everybody was cheering to us, and as we went through towns, people were happy and were giving us encouragement. On the way from Alabama to Texas, they saw that black troops were on the train. They shot at the train. We realized that Jim Crow had taken over and things were going to be very different. But I still wanted to continue to serve, so I re-upped again. This time, I was sent to Wyoming and Nebraska, particularly Fort Robinson, Nebraska. When we got to Fort Robinson, Nebraska, they had a new assignment for us. They sent me from Fort Robinson to San Francisco. When I got to San Francisco, we boarded ships and we were sent to the Philippines. Now, as a result of the Spanish-American War, the United States acquired the Philippines. The Philippine people thought they were going to get their independence. They fought with the United States against Spain, so they thought they were going to get their freedom. That didn't happen. The powers that be at the time decided that America was going to be a multinational empire, so they decided to keep the Philippines. That led to insurrection. Some call it insurrection from the Filipinos' point of view. They fought their war for independence. The 24th, 25th, 9th, and 10th Cavalry were sent to the Philippines to fight the Filipinos. That war continued to last into the early part of the 20th century. We were in rotation, so the Buffalo Soldiers, as well as other units, were rotated back and forth to the Philippines. So at this time, I've been in service quite a while, and it's coming up close to 20 years. And I thought, well, gee, maybe I should retire. I can get one more enlistment, I'll be able to retire. So I re-upped again. And while I was back in the States and I was being a cook, I went on a duty for wood carving duty. I was the cook. While I was cooking, I was bending over the fire. Wind came up, knocked me down, a lump on my head, and I got ashes in my eyes. They took me to the hospital, found out that I'd lost sight in my left eye. So I still tried to do my duty, and I did. Guess what? It was time to re-up again. This time, which would have been my 7th re-enlistment. The post surgeon said, you can't re-up because you have these injuries. Your eyes are bad, and you have this hernia problem, so you're not fit for duty. They didn't let me re-enlist. Well, when I couldn't re-enlist, I wrote letters to my former commanding officers and others that I'd served with and pleaded with them to say, look, if they don't want to give me a pension, let me join the service again and I can still serve. Well, fortunately, the officers said good things for me and made recommendations for me, so I was able to rejoin the Army. And finally, I came back. I was given assignment at the Presidio in California. And while there, I was able to put in for retirement. And in 1908, I was allowed to retire. They also let me be named first sergeant. That's how I got these stripes. I was really a private most of my life. But when it's time to retire, they let me be called a first sergeant so I could get a little bit better pension. Well, after leaving the Army, I decided to get married. I was 48 years old. I married a young woman from Virginia who was 34. We didn't have any children, but we continued to live in around Fort Robinson, Nebraska. And finally, in 1937, I passed away. But while I was around, people said, why would you want to serve so long? Well, I like the cavalry. I love serving in the cav, and I love serving my country. That's why I was a Buffalo Soldier. So there, you have some idea what these guys were going through and what it meant. And I have a few other special things I'll tell you about, and then I'll open it for a few questions. I mentioned there were always white officers, but there are several generals that you probably know. You should know their connection to the Buffalo Soldiers. Douglas MacArthur. When Douglas MacArthur was a little boy, he was at Fort Selden, New Mexico. His father was captain there. That's how he learned to ride. That's how he learned to shoot. The Buffalo Soldiers taught him. The most famous person associated with Buffalo Soldiers was General Pershing. Anybody know General Pershing's nickname? Blackjack Pershing. You know why they called him Blackjack Pershing? Well, when he was a young officer, he was assigned to the 10th Cavalry in New Mexico. Later on, he became an instructor at West Point. He was a very difficult taskmaster. So when the cadets decided they didn't like him too much, behind his back, they started calling him different names. And you can imagine what some of those names were. Eventually, one of them was Black Jack. So the name stuck. Well, Pershing, not only did he serve with the 10th in New Mexico, when the Spanish-American War happened, Pershing resigned his position at West Point to join the 10th Cavalry in Cuba. He was in Cuba with the 10th. After that, of course, he was leader of the expedition to try to capture Pancho Villa, and was a general there at the start of the First World War. He was decided that he would be the commander of our troops in Europe. And so he left, all troops left Mexico, and he became the supreme commander for the United States in Europe. But what happened to the Buffalo Soldiers? They weren't allowed to go to Europe. The Buffalo Soldiers remained stateside and were doing border patrol in the Southwest. There were African Americans who went in the First World War. The most famous is the 369th. 369th didn't serve with the United States. When they got to Europe, they wouldn't let them fight with the Americans. So the French said, we'll take them. They fought with the French. They were trained by the French. They fought with them. And they, in the First World War, they won every award that the French nation could give them. So after that war, the other general I want to tell you about is Benjamin O. Davis. He was the first African American to become general. But he started his career as a Buffalo Soldier. And it was Colonel Young who tutored him so he could pass the exam. So he's one of the first non-commissioned officers who moved up the ranks to actually become general. And as you probably may know, his son also became a general. It was his son who was the leader of the Tuskegee Airmen. Another interesting related fact about Buffalo Soldiers, there was a William Cafe or Kathy Williams. That's right, I said Kathy Williams. There was a female soldier who was in Buffalo Soldiers. Doesn't say much about the medical exams back in those days, but she served for 2 years until she had some medical problems and could no longer do her duties. But she was, in fact, in that enlistment paper, she was discharged as a Buffalo Soldier. So these are just a few things that I would mention, and now I will certainly be willing to answer any questions. Before doing that, I want to say how pleased I am to be able to come to the Grapevine Historical Society and make a presentation. I really enjoy it. This is a very excellent group. You guys do a great job. We enjoyed it. And just a little promo. I see Phil Williams. Phil's right here. He's head of the Westerners, and I'm a member of the Westerners. And I think all of you like Western history, so he would be someone that I would recommend. Phil, yes. And my good friend Dr. McCaslin is over there, and he can correct any historical mistakes I make. Thank you very much. If anyone has any questions, I'll try to answer them as best I can. Just.
What got you interested in the Buffalo Soldiers?
Well, I've always been interested in history, and when I came west, while I was in New Mexico, they had an active Buffalo Soldier group. I went to one of their presentations and said, "Hey, you taking new members?" And they said, "Yes." And so I started reading about it, and the more I read, the more I liked it. And by the way, you would think that this was a very obscure area, but it's not. I put some books in the back that I have, but today there's lots of material if you're interested in following up on this. If you go on YouTube, you will find at least a half dozen videos or more about Buffalo Soldiers. I wouldn't recommend all of them, because some of them I don't find to be very, very accurate, and some of them are a little bit exaggerated. But yeah, that's how I got interested in it. Yes, no.
We lived half the year, about 2 years, half the year here and half the year at Fort Davis.
Oh, yes.
And it's one of the best restored Buffalo Soldier forts anywhere in the United States. And Margaret and Tim can, I'm sure you, along with Jerry and me, that if you're ever out there, you need to go there. It's a marvelous place. And one thing that I'm pleased to say here about Henry Flipper, he was all those years with a dishonorable discharge, until President Bill Clinton reversed that and cleansed his record of the dishonorable discharge.
Okay. Amber alerts. Okay. Yes. No, that's what I know. I agree with you, ma'am. I've been to Fort Davis, and it is a good place to visit. And Flipper was, in fact, court-martialed there at Fort Davis. I've made presentations at Fort Davis, but it is, if you want to go to an authentic fort, it is a good one of the better ones. That and Fort Concho, I think, and Texas, two of the best ones to visit. Yes. Someone else said that. Yes, sir. It doesn't exist anymore. It's sort of in central Texas. It's one of the forts that doesn't.
Bracketville outside of Del Rio.
Good.
They're turning into a very fancy resort.
I told you Dr. McCaslin would be helpful. Anyone else?
I was just going to say, I was going to add to what she said about Fort Davis. I was a little girl growing up in the Alpine area.
Okay.
Fort Davis was nothing. I mean, it was just the adobe buildings that were falling apart. And they came in and redid it, and it's just beautifully done now.
It is.
Parts of information around it you can go through.
They have a hospital there for the
Yes. Mhm.
very, and all the equipment and all the surgical instruments were still there intact. Really neat to see.
Yes.
A lot of college groups go there to work on the hospital.
Yeah, it was
Research.
yeah, I would concur with both of you that it's a very good place to visit. I enjoyed it. Only thing wrong with it is it's so far away, but I enjoyed going there. Anyone else? Yes, right.
Rudy, I think I know this, but Caleb Benson,
Yes,
and that's a real
a real person.
historical.
Yes, he's buried in, well, originally he was buried at Fort Robinson. They disinterred all those people and moved him to Fort McPherson in Nebraska, and he's buried there along with about 60 other Buffalo soldiers. So he's a real person. The story I told is all those things actually happened. Dr. McCaslin.
Just curious, of all the places he was posted and all the places he saw, why did he settle at Fort Robinson? Do you ever?
Well, Fort Robinson at the time was a fort that had a lot of Buffalo soldiers. And of course, they didn't have a lot of money in those days. And so when the guys retired, they stayed together as a little community to support one another. And that's why he was at Fort Robinson. There was camaraderie, and the men supported each other. Those that didn't have much, others took care of them. So it was a pretty common thing. That's why he wound up at Fort Robinson. He had been stationed there, but that's the only reason. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
You said they started right after the Civil War. When would the term Buffalo soldier end? And when would you consider the end of the Buffalo soldier?
Well, for me, I really think of it as the Indian Wars period is from really basically from 1866 to the end of the First World War. There's, as I said earlier, a lot of people use this term. In fact, now some people say anyone who served in a segregated army is a Buffalo soldier. I don't go that far. I don't think that that's correct, but a lot of people, if you go to the Buffalo Soldier Museum in Houston, basically when you get there, you won't just find Buffalo Soldier information. You will find materials about Black veterans in all wars. And so the term has become broadly used because now it's a term of pride. But as I said earlier, it was not used by the men during the Indian Wars period. They didn't call themselves Buffalo Soldiers. Anyone else? Well, you've been a very attentive audience, and I thank you for your time.